Almost every nation needs an enemy. Not necessarily because people are naturally violent or because conflict is somehow inevitable, but because enemies serve a strange and powerful purpose in human societies. They create unity. They simplify complicated problems. And perhaps most importantly, they give people a sense of identity, a clear understanding of who we are, often by defining who we are not. Throughout history, rulers, empires, and political leaders have understood one uncomfortable truth: a divided society becomes far easier to unite when everyone fears the same thing. Ancient Rome had its barbarians. Kings spoke constantly of rival kingdoms and invading forces. During the Cold War, America defined itself against communism, while the Soviet Union built its identity around opposition to capitalism. Even today, modern nations continue to shape themselves through rivalry, fear, and opposition, often defining who they are through the enemies they choose or sometimes create. But why does this pattern repeat itself across centuries, across cultures, and across entirely different political systems? Why do nations seem to function better when they have an enemy? And perhaps more disturbingly, what happens when a country suddenly loses one? To answer that question, we have to go back much further than modern politics, long before borders, governments, or even countries existed. Because the story begins with something much older than nations themselves: tribes. For most of human history, survival depended on belonging to a small group. Resources were limited, danger was constant, and trusting the wrong person could mean death. Naturally, humans learned to separate the world into categories: those who belonged and those who did not. Us and them. It is one of the oldest survival instincts we possess. Psychologists today call this in-group versus out-group thinking, but the idea itself is simple. Humans are remarkably good at forming communities, yet equally skilled at distrusting outsiders. And despite thousands of years of civilization, technology, and political progress, we never truly abandoned that instinct. In many ways, modern nations simply scaled it up, because people are surprisingly easy to unite when they feel threatened. A crisis changes behavior. Political divisions temporarily shrink. People cooperate more. Arguments become less important. Fear creates solidarity. And throughout history, leaders slowly realize something incredibly useful. Nothing brings people together faster than a common enemy. Over time, societies began to grow larger. Small tribes slowly transformed into kingdoms. Kingdoms became empires. And eventually, entire nations emerged. But while the scale changed, human psychology remained surprisingly familiar. People still needed belonging, still needed identity. And perhaps most importantly, they still needed something or someone to unite against. Because unity is difficult, especially in large societies. A village can survive through personal relationships. People know one another, share common experiences, and often trust the same traditions. But an empire is different. Empires are complicated. They are full of different languages, cultures, religions, classes, and political interests, all competing for influence, resources, and power. Keeping millions of people united is extraordinarily difficult. And rulers slowly discovered something powerful. Shared fear often works better than shared ideals. Ancient Rome understood this exceptionally well. The Roman Empire was vast, diverse, and often politically unstable. Internal divisions constantly threatened its survival. Wealth inequality grew. Political rivalries became dangerous. Corruption spread through institutions. Sound familiar? Yet Rome repeatedly managed to maintain loyalty by reinforcing a simple narrative. Rome represented order. Everything beyond Rome represented chaos. To be Roman meant civilization, discipline, law, strength. The world outside the empire, meanwhile, was often portrayed as dangerous, uncivilized, and threatening. Of course, reality was far more complicated than Roman propaganda suggested. Many neighboring societies were highly sophisticated in their own ways. But complexity rarely inspires unity. Simple stories do. And fear works best when the message is easy to understand. We are safe. They are dangerous. Once people accept that idea, something interesting begins to happen. Citizens become more willing to tolerate sacrifice, more willing to accept surveillance, more willing to support military expansion. Even political failures suddenly feel easier to forgive. After all, when danger feels close, stability becomes more important than freedom. And Rome was far from unique. Throughout medieval Europe, rulers constantly relied on external threats to strengthen internal unity. Kings spoke of rival kingdoms preparing invasions. Religious leaders warned of dangerous outsiders threatening civilization itself. Entire populations were mobilized through fear, often convinced that survival depended on defeating an enemy. Sometimes those threats were very real. Sometimes they were exaggerated. And sometimes they were politically useful, because external enemies can distract people from internal problems. Economic instability, political corruption, social division, public dissatisfaction. History shows us something uncomfortable. When societies become unstable, leaders often benefit from redirecting attention outward. Instead of asking difficult questions about problems at home, people begin focusing on threats abroad. Suddenly, political frustration transforms into national unity. Fear becomes focus, and division temporarily disappears. But perhaps the biggest shift came much later, because eventually, nations discovered something even more powerful than military enemies. You no longer needed an invading army. You didn't even need a physical threat. Sometimes, an idea was enough. And few periods in history demonstrate this better than the 20th century. Because by then, entire nations had learned how to build identity not only around enemies they could see, but around enemies they could imagine. By the 20th century, the relationship between nations and enemies had evolved into something far more sophisticated than anything previous empires could have imagined. For most of human history, danger had usually been visible. Threats came in familiar forms: rival kingdoms preparing for invasion, armies gathering at the border, neighboring empires competing for territory and influence. Fear felt immediate, tangible, and deeply personal because people could physically see the forces that threatened them. But modern nations gradually discovered something far more powerful than a visible enemy. Sometimes, the most effective threat was not a country, an army, or even a person. Sometimes, an idea was enough. Few periods illustrate this better than the Cold War, a conflict so psychologically powerful that it reshaped entire societies without ever fully becoming a direct war between its two main rivals. For nearly half a century, much of the world divided itself into opposing camps. On one side stood the United States and its allies, presenting themselves as defenders of freedom, democracy, and individual liberty. On the other stood the Soviet Union, promising equality, collective strength, and an alternative to Western capitalism. Both sides believed they represented progress. Both believed the future depended on their survival. And perhaps most importantly, both needed the other to justify themselves. In the United States, fear of communism gradually became far more than foreign policy. It evolved into something cultural, emotional, and deeply political. Politicians warned that communist influence could infiltrate institutions, schools, media, and even ordinary neighborhoods. Public fear intensified to the point where suspicion alone could destroy careers, friendships, and reputations. At the same time, inside the Soviet Union, Western capitalism was portrayed not as an alternative political system, but as something morally dangerous, a corrupt force driven by greed, exploitation, and instability. American society was frequently presented as chaotic, spiritually empty, and fundamentally hostile to ordinary people. Different ideologies, different political systems. And yet, underneath the surface, something remarkably similar was happening on both sides. Fear was creating unity. Because enemies do not merely create anxiety, they create purpose. A nation facing a powerful threat often becomes more cohesive, more focused, and more willing to tolerate forms of political power that might otherwise feel unacceptable. Citizens become more accepting of surveillance, larger military budgets, stricter policies, and limitations that would normally provoke resistance, all because fear changes the way societies think. When people feel genuinely threatened, freedom begins to feel negotiable in ways that are difficult to imagine during peaceful times. Security suddenly becomes more important. Stability begins to matter more than disagreement. And leaders throughout history have repeatedly understood this instinct with remarkable precision. This, of course, does not mean threats are imaginary. Wars happen. Empires compete. Countries genuinely fight for power, resources, and survival. History is filled with moments where danger was very real. But what makes enemies politically useful is not simply their existence, it is the emotional clarity they provide. A society struggling with complicated internal problems can suddenly feel united when attention shifts outward. Economic decline becomes easier to explain. Political frustration feels less important. Social divisions temporarily weaken. Instead of asking difficult questions about inequality, corruption, or failing institutions, people begin focusing on the threat beyond the border. Fear simplifies complexity, and complex societies often crave simple explanations. Perhaps that is why nations sometimes become so emotionally attached to their rivals. Over time, enemies stop being temporary threats and begin shaping identity itself. Countries stop asking, "Who are we becoming?" and instead quietly begin asking, "Who are we against?" The answer to that question can shape entire generations. But eventually, every rivalry faces the same uncomfortable problem. What happens when the enemy disappears? Because history suggests that nations are often far less comfortable with peace than they like to admit. The end of the Cold War should have changed everything. For decades, the world had been organized around a clear rivalry. Political systems, military alliances, national identities, and even ordinary cultural life had revolved around a single defining tension: East versus West. And then, suddenly, it was over. The Soviet Union collapsed. Communism lost much of its global influence. And for a brief moment, many believed humanity had entered an entirely new era, one defined not by rivalry, but by cooperation. Some political thinkers even argued that history itself had reached an endpoint. Liberal democracy, global trade, and economic integration seemed destined to spread across the world, gradually replacing ideological conflict with stability and prosperity. For a while, that future almost felt possible. Yet something strange happened. Instead of becoming calmer, many societies became increasingly anxious. Because nations that had spent decades defining themselves against a powerful enemy suddenly faced an uncomfortable question. Who are we now? Without a rival, national identity often becomes harder to sustain. Political unity weakens. Internal disagreements become more visible. Divisions that once seemed secondary suddenly move to the center of public life. When there is no obvious threat beyond the border, people often begin looking inward. And sometimes they begin turning against each other. In many countries, political polarization intensified after the Cold War rather than disappearing. Old ideological rivalries were replaced by new cultural, political, and social divisions. The enemy no longer always looked foreign. Sometimes, the enemy became internal. A political movement, an ideology, a cultural group, even fellow citizens. Because the psychology itself never disappeared. The instinct to divide the world into us and them remained deeply human. Only the categories changed. And perhaps this reveals something uncomfortable about how societies function. Nations do not simply organize around shared values. Often, they organize around shared fears. Fear creates emotional clarity. It creates belonging. It transforms millions of strangers into something that feels emotionally connected. A nation. And leaders, whether kings, emperors, presidents, or political movements, have repeatedly understood the extraordinary power of this dynamic. Sometimes responsibly, sometimes dangerously. Because while enemies can create unity, they can also distort reality. Fear simplifies complicated problems into comforting stories. Economic struggles become someone else's fault. Political failures become easier to excuse. Moral complexity disappears. And over time, societies may begin protecting their identity not through understanding, but through opposition. History shows us that countries are often at their most unified when they feel threatened. But it also shows something darker. Societies built entirely around enemies eventually struggle to imagine themselves without conflict. The Roman Empire constantly searched for new frontiers. European powers spent centuries defining themselves through endless rivalries. The 20th century revolved around ideological enemies powerful enough to shape entire generations. And even now, modern politics continues to reward division, outrage, and fear with remarkable efficiency. Because enemies are emotionally useful. They provide certainty in uncertain times. And certainty is persuasive. But perhaps the real question is not whether nations need enemies. History suggests that many believe they do. The deeper question is this: can societies remain united without one? Can people build belonging through shared goals instead of shared fear? Can nations define themselves by what they hope to become, rather than who they oppose? History offers no easy answer. But it does leave us with one uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps nations do not merely fight enemies. Sometimes they quietly depend on them.